Hello, America, and good day to our friends around the world. This is a political talk show here on WRMN. Thank you very much for listening on WRMN 1410 AM and simulcast live on WRMN1410.com. Thanks for listening on the podcast or watching on YouTube. This is our series on the Constitution. My name is Dennis Green. I am the host and moderator of a political talk show Monday through Friday on WRMN, where we go through the news through a constitutional type of lens, not through a party bias lens. We welcome everybody to listen as long as they come in through a fact-based and good faith argument out of it. We want to make sure that we open up a marketplace of ideas that lets everybody join in. So a political talk show has been putting on this series about the Constitution because it is important for us that live in the United States. It is something that here in the United States, we have the rule of law. What that means is essentially we are a type of government that is a republic. And what a republic is, down to its kind of simplest elevator pitch type of thing, of if I was to convince you to live in a republic, would be a group of people that all agree that the law applies to everyone, and that is what makes our system fair. So what is the law? What is the foundational legislation of our system here in the United States? Well, that is the Constitution. So before this one, this is part of a series. So the one that's before this is kind of an introduction where we go over the Articles of the Confederation and go into why we needed a constitution and what were the kind of founding principles of why the founding fathers put together a constitution and why there were people that didn't want one. So if you want to watch that, listen to that, that's probably in the playlist that you found this episode here. But today we finally break into the Constitution, and we break in through Article 1. And Article 1 is all about the legislative structure of how our other laws can be created through this legislative branch. Article 1 of the Constitution lays out the structural and foundational functions of the legislative branch. Its placement as the first article underscores the primacy of the founders assigned it to the authority. So because it is the first one, this becomes the major authority of the framework of this Republican government. And I don't mean Republican government as in the party of the Republicans. And when I mention democracy, I don't mean it in the framework of the Democrat Party either. Originally, the Republican Democrats were together. And because in our system, we have a system that is a republic, that we use democracy to find our representation to continue on the government and the rule of our nation. So what we're going to do is we're going to go over this section of Article 1. It offers not just operational rules of Congress, but a window into the constitutional theory and the compromises that formed the new federal government in 1787. Now, a lot of people are like, well, we became a nation in 1776. Well, that was when the Declaration of Independence came out, and we turned around and said, we are independent people. Now, the establishment of the nation, the laying down of the laws, the different congresses that had to happen, the meetings in Philadelphia and other places needed to still happen before we finally found the foundation of this nation. So let's talk about the article itself. Now, this is the creation of the bicameral legislation. And what that means is that we have two chambers that are in here. So let's look at Article 1, Section 1, right off the bat. All legislative powers herein granted shall be vested in a Congress of the United States, which shall consist of a Senate and a House of Representatives. Now, you can find that directly from Article 1, Section 1. This clause defines the U.S. Congress and allocates all legislative authority to the Congress. The decision to establish the two chambers of a legislator emerged from intense debate during the Constitutional Convention, ultimately resulting in the Connecticut Compromise, also known as the Great Compromise. Now, there were a few compromises in there, and we'll go through them as they come up within the Constitution in this. But part of this Great Compromise was establishing those two sides of an equal representation through the Senate and then a populist representation through the House of Representatives. And the way that these people and these senators and congresspeople and representatives, whatever you'd like to call them, of this Congress, you can see where the importance lies in the balance based off of their election schedule. And you guessed it, the Constitution puts it together. But let's talk a little bit about where we came up with this Great Compromise. Delegates from large states advocated for proportional representation. Obviously, the big states were like, hey, we need more representation. We are bigger. We have either more landmass or a larger population, or however it is. But this starts to see how the forefathers thought in the future. Well, what happens if another state takes over or this side comes over here? This is where James Madison from the Virginia Plan. Madison was a Virginia delegate and key architect of the Constitution and was instrumental in shaping the structure of the government. But small states were fearing domination, supported equal representation consistent with the New Jersey Plan. The compromise created a House of Representatives based off of population and a Senate with equal representation per state. The reasoning was not only political, but also philosophical. The founders, steeped in the Enlightenment, thought this was the age of enlightenment or the age of reason. They thought that ancient republicanism drew lessons from both classical antiquity and more recent failures like the Articles of the Confederation. Classical writers such as Polybus and Montesquieu emphasized the importance of mixed government, balancing the interests of different social groups and preventing tyranny through institutional design. James Madison, in the Federalist Paper number 51, described the legislature as the most natural and potentially dangerous branch because of its closeness to the people. The two sides, or the two chambers, served as an internal check against hasty majoritarian legislation. This structure echoed the British Parliament House of Commons and the House of Lords, but it was modified to reflect American republicanism, not hereditary titles, and direct representation with the elections. So as you go through the first article, the second section takes care of how we elect our representation. whether it's the House of Representatives or we put a person to the Senate from the state. So in Section 2, it takes the House of Representatives. The term is 2 years. The qualifications are a minimum age of 25, 7 years as a U.S. citizen, and have to be a resident of that state that you are running for. The apportionment tied to population originally counted slaves as 3/5, and that was part of the 3/5 compromise. The 14th Amendment obviously changed that. The House of Representatives also has another power called the power of impeachment. That is also put together in the second section of Article 1. The short-term and lower age requirements of the House were designed to create a chamber closely tied to public sentiment. It was intended to be the most democratic body in the federal structure. This design borrowed from the colonial assemblies and British lower house, but grounded them in a new idea of popular sovereignty. 2 years of going around, you obviously have somebody who needs to be legislating and campaigning at the same time. Also, 2 years gives people enough time to go into a system that the House of Representatives should be pushing along and filling in people into the House of Representatives, not having the same people over and over again. 2 terms with that minimum age of 25, the House of Representatives is supposed to be the closest to the actual people's vote. Anything closer than this would be a direct vote by the people, and that was the tyranny of the mob that Benjamin Franklin warned about. As we walk through Article 1, Section 3 talks about the Senate. Now, this is where the Founding Fathers wanted to really put together the actual, I guess, business end of the legislation. With a 6-year term and staggered elections, only 1/3 repeats every 2 years. So there still is an election, but only 1/3 is put together. The qualifications are a minimum age of 30, so they raise the age, and 9 years as a U.S. citizen and being a resident of the state. Each state gets 2 senators. Vice president is the presiding officer, and they have the sole power to try the impeachments. The House of Representatives brings forth impeachments and articles of impeachment. They vote to impeach the president. The president then turns around and is tried by the Senate, and the Senate determines the outcome of that impeachment. The Senate's design was meant to provide stability and continuity. That's where that 6 years of the term comes. By insulating senators from direct public pressure, initially elected by state legislators when they first came out, the founders sought to ensure a deliberate body resistant to the volatility of the popular politics. So they still wanted representation of the people, but they didn't want it to be at the whim of the people, but at the deliberate behest of the people. I know that's a little bit of a semantic, but they didn't want a senator to constantly be campaigning and worrying about that. With a 6-year term, they are able to actually get into the nitty-gritty weeds, minutia of legislation. This reflected the classical fears of the mob rule and lessons from the rapid decline in ancient republics. Populism really drives a stake through the government. And I'm not saying that populism is bad, because obviously populism is, by definition, what the people want. But the whims of the people versus the needs versus the care and versus the structure of the system that we live in needs to have something as a stability and long term, which again is why, if you look at it, the Senate has a longer term than even the executive branch. Originally, the state legislators selected the senators, a structural link between states and federal government. This changed with the 17th Amendment in 1913, which insulated direct election of senators, reflecting progressive era reforms in that 1913 progressive era. And it aimed to curb corruption and increase democratic accountability. When we get into the Article 4 and we get into the 10th Amendment, we'll talk about how states have the power to decide their representation outside of what is presented here in the Constitution as its core side. We'll go on to the legislative process in Section 7. This is where they get their actual power to govern. We talked about why they're needed. We talked about who is in charge. Now let's talk about what they can do. In Section 7, all bills for raising revenue shall originate in the House of Representatives, but the Senate may propose or concur with amendments as on other bills. Bills must pass through both chambers and be presented to the president for approval or veto. Congress may override a veto by the 2/3 majority in both chambers. Requiring revenue bills to begin in the House was a nod to the British principle that taxation should originate in the House closest to the people. This principle was deeply embedded in colonial grievances, famously encapsulated in the slogan, "No taxation without representation." INS versus Chadha in 1983, the Supreme Court invalidated the legislative veto, affirming the presentment clause and requiring both houses as essential constitutional requirements. They wanted to make sure that it was the people and how close it was for that taxation, for that accountability on the laws that would be made. Because if you had somebody who could not be removed or changed, and that person was dictating things, the people were not in charge, that person was. That's why we have the checks and balances we have now. Article 1, Section 8 contains 18 clauses detailing Congress's explicit powers. This is what they are allowed to do within this section. This is what they have explicitly. Not any other branch, not any other person, not one single representative or one single senator or one single committee. This is what Congress as a whole has the power to do in what is laid out in how they can do it in Section 7. So they have the power of taxation and spending, what comes in, what goes out, borrowing money, regulating commerce, both interstate and foreign commerce. So that deals with tariffs, that deals with what is banned within the United States as far as imports and exports, and what is interstate-wise too. They also establishing naturalization laws on how people can become a citizen. They coin money and regulate its value. So when they talk about printing money or getting more money into the system, this is part of that regulating its value. They are also tasked with creating post offices, declaring war, and raising and supporting military forces. Those are the specific things that our Congress is supposed to be doing. If someone else is doing them, or if Congress is not doing them, that is specifically against the Constitution as it has been written. If we skip ahead a little bit more, because a lot of the other pieces of the clauses, including Section 8 and going down, add those different instances about the borrowing money, of creating money, etc., etc. But when we get to the Clause 18 of necessary and proper, to make all laws which shall be necessary and proper for carrying out into execution the foregoing powers. This clause was a subject of heated debate. Anti-federalist Patrick Henry feared it would lead to an expansion of federal power at the expense of the states. Madison and Alexander Hamilton, New York delegate at the first secretary and the first secretary of Treasury, in the Federalist Papers, they sought to reassure the public that this clause was not a blank check, but rather a practical necessity for implementing enumerated powers. McCulloch versus Maryland in 1819 reaffirms that. John Marshall says, let the end be legitimate, let it be within the scope of the Constitution, and all means which are appropriate are constitutional. Congress can't do a few things, like they cannot suspend habeas corpus. They cannot pass bills of attainder or post facto laws. What that means is they cannot pass a bill about a specific group of people, just like they cannot pass a bill and have it retroactively affect anybody. They can't grant titles of nobility or tax exports from the states. They enter treaties, they coin money, and they listen to you. Article 1 of the constitutional engine of representative government. It's where lawmaking begins and where the will of the electorate is supposed to be the most directly expressed. The genius of Article 1 lies not only in its design, but its adaptability. Next in line is Article 2. This brings the executive branch put together. You've been listening to A Political Talk Show here on WRMN. Thanks for sticking around. Thanks for being part of this journey through the Constitution with us. You can find the entire podcast wherever you find your favorite podcasts, or you can watch the show on YouTube at WRMN Radio. We'll see you on the next one.